Good morning. My name is Alvaro Ortiz. This is my review of a professional journal article in the course Read 884 Literacy Development. My chosen article is entitled The Perceptions of Japanese Students Toward Academic English Reading, Implications for Effective ESL Reading Strategies by Yuko Iwai in the publication Multicultural Education. The reason I chose this article is because although I am Peruvian Canadian, I'm currently living in Nagoya, Japan, and my two jobs are teaching English as a second language to grade 8 students, and I also teach film in English to students who are in grade 11 and 12. And although they have a very firm grasp of English, almost all of them have Japanese as their native language and have English as their second language. This article is a qualitative study that follows the experiences of two native Japanese students who were studying in the USA, and they were asked to contrast their English language learning strategies with those that they experienced when they were studying in Japan, either as high school students or as university students in their undergraduate degree. What's interesting in this article is that the researcher gives a brief overview of the theories regarding the development of literacy, describing the behaviorist, innatist, and especially the interactionist theory. And that interactionist theory figures pretty strongly into this article because one of the points that the researcher makes is that the purposes, the reasons that the two students were learning English were quite different when you compare their motivation in the USA versus in Japan. One of the reasons for that is that in Japan, English learning is primarily motivated by the need to pass an English exam in order to get into university. So even a Japanese language university that's not focused on the English language still requires English proficiency, a baseline English proficiency. So every student who wants to get into university needs to pass an English exam. So consequently, all English instruction, well, not all, but most English instruction here in Japan is strongly focused on reaching those goals and meeting that external motivation of passing that exam. And that exam is focused more on having a good grasp of grammar, of how grammar makes meaning in a sentence, and the individual meanings of words, so having a very wide vocabulary. So consequently, a Japanese student who is studying for this exam makes heavy use of a dictionary, stops to look up individual words, and something that is not focused on as much is attending to the entire meaning of an utterance of a passage of a work. So what the author is truly intending by the entire passage in context. So this researcher continued to work with these Japanese students who were now in the USA, and their experience of learning English in the USA was totally different because it was more socially mediated. They had to use English to basically survive, but also they had chosen what they wanted to study. So they were motivated by having chosen topics that were of interest to them, and what they were reading now was things that they liked. So the way that they had to read was markedly different. Now they didn't have time to stop and search every word in the dictionary, but they had to mentally look at the entire passage and determine what was the most important word, and then maybe look up that word only. So in this context, in the American context, the two students are reading English in a totally different way, in a more holistic way, where they have to evaluate the meaning of a sentence, not just from the individual units, the vocabulary and the grammar, but from the context, from the meaning of the whole passage, and then they make a judgment about what is the most important thing that they need to look up. And so the end result was that these students said that they were more motivated to read English. This article was particularly interesting to me and relevant for my practice because, like I mentioned before, I teach students who are in the second year of junior high school, so that would be grade 8. And I want them to take a similar approach, reading more holistically and attending to the meaning of the entire text. And it's very common, yes, to be focused, to be hyper-focused on the meaning of individual words. And my students, and it's a general trend in Japanese middle school students, that when they're writing, they tend to write first in Japanese, and then either by using machine translation, they translate into English, and then they write their thoughts out in English. But they do have a strong knowledge of grammar, especially because they compare it with the grammar in Japanese. And even without technology, they're able to make those sorts of translations. However, I really think that a more intrinsic motivation would be to read material that they are interested in. And I want to teach them strategies such as strategic note-taking, which this article focuses on, skimming, and basically develop a system of mentally parsing out the most important or salient items in a sentence. And I really want them to move away from a building blocks approach that kind of takes a passage or a paragraph and treats it kind of like alphabet soup, and you start to put together all the words and get the meaning from that. But there are other factors such as context, such as what was previously read, such as the theme of the book. I really want their reading comprehension to be brought to a whole nother level. And at the same time, based on what we read in chapter 2 and 3 of the text, I'm also aware that the fundamentals of literacy are really important, and I want to keep challenging students with new vocabulary, with academic language, and expand their schemas. And I also don't want to forget about the oral component, about orally expressing themselves. So I really want them to receive a more holistic English education in that sense as well. So to summarize the implications for my practice, I want students to have a more holistic approach to reading without neglecting the fundamentals, especially the fundamentals that we've just read in chapters 2 and 3 of the text regarding phonological awareness and oral language use. For me, this article is challenging me to provide my junior high school and my high school students with rich content-related vocabulary that's related to their interests. So one of the classes that I teach here in Japan, it's grade 8 ESL, and the other one I mentioned was grade 11 and 12 film. And in the film class, it's a content class, but my students are also English learners. Many of them are English learners, even though their English proficiency is quite high. But they still need a lot of support to be able to write essays about film and to express their opinions in the way that they want to be totally authentic in how they express themselves. So in that class, even though it's a content class, I do have to scaffold a lot of vocabulary, scaffold a lot of language concepts. And in my practice, I really want to balance those two things. My class is a film class, and there is another, in this school, there's another English class. So it's not my job to teach English, but it also kind of is my job to have English language supports in every content-related class. Like, they should be integrated fully. So I want to find the best ways to do that, to integrate English language supports for English learners, even in a content-related class as sophisticated as film. And so something else that I was thinking about, especially when reading about cognitive academic language proficiency, is that I see that there is an opposition, and if not an opposition, a tension between CALP and the teaching of communicative competence. What I mean is, academic language is very abstract and challenges a student to use abstract reasoning quite strongly. And that really, really pushes their boundaries, especially if they're delving into content areas that they have no experience with. So that can be hard to learn and teach, because as we've read in the textbook, teaching is best done when it's relatable to students' experiences in a context, related to their context, contextualized and not taken out of context. So I see these two things as a tension, and I really want to figure out and understand how to make this a productive tension, how to leverage both of these things to create good exercises and lessons for my students. Those two things are teaching academic language that challenges my students to think abstractly, while also continually making connections to daily experiences, to things that are already in my students' schemas, so that they are able to make stronger connections between their L1 and their L2, especially in the context of English learners. And therefore, improve the literacy for both students in my dedicated ESL class and students in my film class. Thank you very much for your attention. Bye-bye.